What's going on, Collectibles family? It is another video on the Collectibles Dad channel. Thanks very much for joining me here today. Today we're talking all about graded video games. This is one of my passions, one of the collectibles categories that I like to dive into. I've got a few up here. I'll grab a couple to show in a minute. But thank you very much for joining me here today. If you're looking for all kind of the non-sports collectible style talk, we'll talk about a variety of different collectibles. We'll talk about markets and, speculate on future values and all the fun stuff with that. So yeah, thank you very much for joining. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and we will dive right in. So the state of the graded video game market. This one is so interesting to me because we had kind of a boom with games, not in the same way that we saw with sports cards going back to 2020, 21, or Pokemon cards, or comic books, some of the more established markets. Graded video games and really collecting video games is still fairly new. It's highly, highly speculative.
The Empire is on the verge of success.
If you look at the grading space, VGA's been grading for a little over 10 years. And WATA, really kind of the main grading company, has been grading for about 5 years. And now we've got CGC that has entered the fray, and they've been grading for a couple of years, about 2 years now. I don't own a VGA graded game, but I do have a CGC of NES Pinball. And this is a lot of what I collect are the early Nintendo games, the black box, the first 30 black box Nintendo games. I collect them, as well as just other NES titles. So what I think is really interesting is games were really starting to get going. Atari was a little bit before me, but Atari was that first console that really took off. And so I do think those old sealed Atari games are really interesting as well. But for me, it's kind of funny because in sports cards, you have the vintage collectors, then you have the modern collectors. Some people collect both, but they're very passionate about each one. And so for me, I don't understand at all the draw to buy kind of a new game and then grade that out and try to sell those or collect those just because, they come out, they're pretty mass produced, of course, which these were mass produced as well if we go back to Atari and Nintendo. But there's more fun with it, I believe, because it's more about kind of what survived the times. When you go back to old baseball cards, it's kind of similar. Was there a shortage of 50s baseball cards? No, they printed a ton of 50s baseball cards. But who kept them, and then who kept them in good condition? And with old Nintendo games and Atari games, they were meant to be opened and played. They weren't meant to be collected. And this is something that's important in a category for me, is if something wasn't really meant to be collected, then it stayed in really good condition, I think that is really interesting, because a lot of times with values too, the reason why stuff becomes valuable is because it is hard to find a sealed game from 40 years ago or just a CIB complete in box where it's still in great shape. And so that adds kind of the fun of it. Now, it is the 80s. They did mass produce video games, so there could very well be a Toys R Us treasure trove that's buried underground somewhere, and they dig it up and they find thousands of sealed games, and it kind of blows up the market. Of course, it is. It's always possible, but you could argue that's really possible for any type of pop culture item going back, to even the 60s, 70s, 80s. A lot of that stuff mass produced. So for me, I really focus on who are the iconic characters that I think are going to be around, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now. Who are going to be the characters that people know and are aware of and collect, or, what's that next generation going? Who are they going to know? And for me, it's Mario. They're building Mario Land down in Orlando. They've got one of the highest grossing movies of the year was the animated Super Mario Brothers movie that came out, which was great. All the nostalgia they threw in. They previewed Yoshi coming into the second one. I've got this one, the original Mario Brothers NES classic, of course. And on the back of the grading slab here on the label, first game starring Mario, first appearance of Luigi. This is the sort of stuff that I want to have if I'm collecting, that I want to hold on to over the long term, because I think that it's going to be interesting, especially as games evolve and they're not physical copies, they're more digital. And then, are they selling them in a box anymore? The big draw on these is the box art. It's really a piece of artwork to game collectors. When they look at that old Atari game, that old NES game, they're looking at that box art may as well be a Picasso. It's not necessarily even just the cartridge and the manual and everything. That's cool. That's all part of it. That's awesome. But it's really that old box and the 8-bitness of, NES. And even, there's Super Nintendo collectors or Sega Genesis collectors. It's the same sort of idea. And so for me as a whole, I like where it is now. Collectibles as a whole have come way down. I mainly own CIB, but I've really been looking more at sealed stuff now. Now that graded games have come down in price, a lot of people gotten out, speculators moving out of the market, money's moving to different areas. Man, there's sealed games that all of a sudden, they were 5-figure games, all of a sudden are kind of within range. And so this is where I've decided to focus. I do think I am a believer in this category over a long period of time for certain games, for certain things. And I'm mainly focused around specific IP, like I mentioned, Mario Brothers, Zelda, some of the big games, Final Fantasy. Does the game have historical relevance with Nintendo? Does it have historical relevance with Atari? And maybe for Sega Genesis, for depending on which game we're talking about. I think it's a fun time, especially if you're collecting. These are also really cool display pieces. So to me, it's an opportunity to have something that I feel like has historical relevance, that looks cool, that has that nostalgic effect that brings me back to my childhood. So for me, graded games, absolutely. This is a fun space, and I do want to continue to add to my collection over time. I mentioned the original 30 black box games or kind of what's on the radar, but I'm trying to think and strategize because, like I said, I was really focused on CIB copies, but now I'm kind of seeing sealed copies of different games. Metroid would be an example of a game that I would like to add. I've got Kid Icarus, but some of these really early Nintendo games that I am just, that I love, Ghosts and Goblins, or for me, I just think it's a great time. You've got good grading companies, you've got WATA and CGC, and you've got VGA. So you really have 3 companies that are doing good work here in the grading space. And I think looking back, when grading first entered the sports card space, which granted people had been collecting sports cards for decades at that stage, but people push back against it. It was like, we don't need this. We don't need any sort of grading. When I see third-party grading get attached to a specific collectible and it looks like it's starting to take hold and there are collectors in the space, there's not a massive amount of collectors of this sort of stuff, which is fine with me, frankly. That means that the prices are not going to be absolutely crazy right now. But I do think that over time, especially with games just being popular among young people, that's never really slowed down, going all the way back to the 80s. Of course, we had the Atari gaming crash, but with Nintendo, it's just recharged itself into an entertainment medium that is not going away anytime soon. It's amazing. And so these pieces are really amazing. And so I'm excited about graded games as we move forward, especially the vintage stuff. That's what I'm focused on. It's the Atari and it's NES. That's the stuff that I'm really focused around in this category. But let me know your thoughts. Graded games, it's kind of gone through this this up and downness, kind of with with COVID money and stimulus money and all that. There was people that got in, got out. There were some huge sales, and then it's kind of subsided. But this is a cool space. So let me know your thoughts. Stay healthy, stay awesome, and I will talk to you again later.